On the grounds of the Catholic University of America in Washington, Ethiopian religious manuscripts are coming to life.
You may have a feeling that the resurrection story you know isn't the whole picture. For nearly 2,000 years, most of the world has been told a version that ends with an empty tomb, a stone rolled aside, and then nothing. Almost like the story fades to black and the credits begin to roll. But that ending was never accepted everywhere. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to stories that challenge the familiar and make you question what you thought you already understood, go ahead and like and subscribe, because what comes next pulls from ancient manuscripts, living traditions, and questions that can't be brushed aside with a simple, "That's just how it is." And as you listen, ask yourself quietly, if a page of this story had been missing all along, would you want to read it? Far from Rome, high in the rock-carved monasteries of Ethiopia's mountains, monks have preserved another way of telling this story for centuries. They don't speak of the Bible as a closed and final collection, as it's often viewed in the West, but as something broader, something larger. Their Bible contains not 66 books, but 81. Pages few people have ever seen, accounts rarely discussed, traditions that never passed through the same hands or filters that shaped European Christianity. And within this ancient collection, it's said, there exists a view of the resurrection that goes far beyond simply declaring that it happened, offering instead a deeper, more expansive perspective that most of the world has never been told. Rather than concentrating only on the moment of the resurrection itself, this perspective tries to explain what followed, what truly changed from that point forward. It goes beyond ideas of death and heaven, reaching into how God was understood, what the soul really is, and whether humans were ever meant to have direct access to truth, or at least the promise of it. According to those who preserve this tradition, these books survived precisely because they existed far from church councils, enforced reforms, and the religious power struggles that decided what was acceptable to read and what was not. They were guarded within a small, disciplined community, passed down quietly through silence, devotion, and time itself. This is where the story takes on even greater weight. The 81 books are not presented as random additions, but as ancient writings believed to be close to the earliest followers, texts that were later pushed aside rather than disproven. In the Christian West, certain names came to mark the edges of belief: Enoch, Jubilees, Maccabees. For centuries, many Western scholars treated them as symbolic, secondary, or even mythical. Yet in Ethiopia, these texts never disappeared. They lived on through language, worship, and collective memory. One especially striking detail comes from the Germa Gospels, discovered in an Ethiopian monastery. Radiocarbon dating places them between 330 and 600 CE, making them some of the oldest surviving illuminated Christian manuscripts in existence. While large parts of Europe moved into periods of upheaval and loss, these remote regions continued copying texts, preserving parchments, and passing down a form of the faith that remained closely tied to its origins. And the content of these books is neither gentle nor reassuring. Take the Book of Enoch. It doesn't simply say that humanity failed before the flood. It asks why. It describes a collapse of cosmic order when 200 watchers descended to Earth, took human wives, and shared forbidden knowledge: how to forge weapons, manipulate desire, and read the movements of the stars. This is portrayed not just as rebellion, but as a dangerous exchange, knowledge given to humanity before it was ready to bear its weight. By this reasoning, the real issue wasn't simple disobedience. It was humanity gaining access to knowledge before the right time, outside its proper place. Supporters of this view believe that this unsettling picture of a chaotic, unstable world, one that's difficult to govern or control, is exactly why the Book of Enoch was pushed aside in the Roman world, while Ethiopia chose to protect it. But Enoch is only the first layer. According to this account, what truly challenges the reader appears in a text linked directly to the resurrection, often called the Book of the Covenant. In the more familiar tradition, Jesus briefly appears after rising from the dead and then departs. Here, however, the focus rests on the 40 days that followed, days that are described as anything but calm or incidental. These 40 days are not portrayed as a time of gentle goodbyes, but as an intense period of instruction. There are no public sermons meant for crowds. Instead, there is teaching. Not comforting parables, but explanations about the nature of reality, the structure of creation, vibrations and forces unseen, and a final struggle not fought with weapons or armies, but with understanding itself. For the scholars and sages who hold this tradition, the difference between a Bible of 81 books and one of 66 is far more than a numerical detail. The larger collection represents a harder, more demanding path, while the shorter canon reflects a version shaped for wider acceptance. From this viewpoint, the Bible most people know is not false, but incomplete, not wrong, but edited. As some of these long-hidden texts are now being translated and shared, it feels as though something sealed away for centuries has been unlocked. They read less like polished stories meant to comfort and more like raw archives left unfinished. And if tales of giants and fallen angels already challenge the imagination, one question remains: what impact would the words attributed to Jesus during those 40 days have? Words barely mentioned in the Gospels, most people know. According to this narrative, it is during those days that the message itself takes a darker, deeper, and more demanding turn. The risen Christ gathers his followers not just to reassure them, but to ready them. What unfolds is the description of a spiritual conflict. The world, consumed by power, wealth, and outward display, is portrayed as a stage largely influenced by a deceiving force. A clear warning follows: do not build temples of stone, because stone eventually falls. Instead, build an inner sanctuary that cannot be razrushed. This is not offered as a soft metaphor, but as direct instruction. The narrative also delivers an early warning about religious institutions themselves. It speaks of a time when people will invoke his name, dress in sacred clothing, and grow rich from devotion. There is even a reference to a future Rome that would turn a symbol of sacrifice into a tool of authority and control. What unsettles modern readers is how closely these warnings seem to align with historical events that unfolded long after the text was written. Alongside this, a distinct view of humanity is presented. Every person, the text says, is shaped by two opposing forces, like two winds. One leads toward life, the other pulls toward error. And error is not described as simple pessimism or bad choices, but as something invasive, almost parasitic. It enters through unchecked desire, a gaze fixed on what should not be sought, and words that distort truth. When this force takes hold, it hardens a person from the inside, turning them into what the text calls a walking tomb. The image is striking: someone who breathes, eats, and moves through the world, yet is hollow within. In contrast, the cure offered is not ritual, sacrifice, or money. It is knowledge, awareness of the self, and constant attention to one's own thoughts. The teaching begins with a striking idea. The kingdom of God is not somewhere out in the world, but within, found in the quiet space between one thought and the next. From this point of view, such a message would be deeply unsettling to any empire that depends on obedience rather than individual conscience. The text weaves its warnings together with observations about the natural world. For centuries, references to moving air, hidden winds, or deep channels of water beneath the earth were dismissed as poetic language. Today, some readers see them differently, as early hints of global air currents or vast underground water systems that science would only identify much later. To those who follow this tradition, these parallels suggest the text held layers of knowledge far beyond its time. The tone here is anything but peaceful. It doesn't echo the familiar gentleness of well-known passages. Instead, it carries the urgency of final words spoken before a departure. Among its most unsettling elements is a warning. darkness will not arrive as an obvious enemy. It will come wearing a familiar face, disguised as truth, embraced as salvation. Not as a demon to be feared, but as something people willingly accept. Alongside this warning is mention of a practice reserved for only a few, a disciplined method combining controlled breathing and focused attention. It closely resembles techniques now linked to Eastern spiritual traditions. This detail has fueled long-standing questions about the unrecorded years of Jesus' life and possible encounters with India or Tibet. Through this lens, Ethiopian teachings seem to connect with ideas like reincarnation, karma, and inner energy centers, expressed through ancient language rather than modern terms. And yet, another question follows. If such power truly existed, where is the evidence? According to this tradition, the answer isn't written in any book. It is said to exist in a specific place, small, remote, and carefully guarded, so secluded that reaching it is nearly impossible. To understand this forbidden place, we first need to understand Ethiopia, and something that, for its people, is not a distant myth, but a living reality: the Ark of the Covenant. In Western films and novels, the Ark is often portrayed as lost forever or buried somewhere in the deserts of Egypt. In Ethiopia, that idea is firmly rejected. There, it is widely believed that the Ark still exists, kept within a special church in the ancient city of Axum, the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. This belief is not treated as folklore or legend. It is a foundation of Ethiopia's religious faith and national identity. According to tradition, the story begins with the Queen of Sheba. She is said to have journeyed to Jerusalem, met King Solomon, and later returned home carrying his child. That child, Menelik, would grow up to become Ethiopia's first king. Years later, Menelik traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon reportedly offered him the throne, but Menelik declined. Still, he did not return to Ethiopia empty-handed. The Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's royal chronicle, tells how Menelik and his companions secretly replaced the true Ark of the Covenant with a replica and carried the real Ark out of Jerusalem without anyone noticing. From this perspective, the Ark was never a symbolic or decorative object. Biblical accounts describe it as a force capable of killing, emitting fire, and overpowering entire armies. To modern readers, these descriptions sound less like myth and more like the effects of intense energy, something closer to radiation or an advanced power source than a ceremonial chest. And this is where the story becomes even more unsettling. According to this tradition, the Ark is never left unguarded. It is entrusted to a single keeper, a man who devotes the rest of his life to protecting it and is never allowed to leave the sacred grounds again. Accounts from visitors describe these guardians as often losing their eyesight, their skin taking on a yellowed tone, and their lives ending far too early. It's hard to explain how a simple wooden object could cause such effects unless it isn't simply wood at all. Some believe the Ark was an ancient form of technology. Others see it as a communication device from a time before organized religion as we know it. Whatever its true nature, Ethiopia has guarded it for nearly 3,000 years. And there is another fact that many find impossible to ignore. Ethiopia is the only African nation that was never permanently colonized. When Italy attempted to conquer the country in the late 19th century, the Ethiopian forces achieved a stunning and unexpected victory at the Battle of Adwa. To some, this was nothing short of a miracle. To others, it suggests that something unseen may have influenced the outcome of the battle. There are also claims that European secret societies knew of these stories. The Knights Templar, for example, are said to have traveled to Ethiopia in the 11th century in search of the Ark itself. Even today, symbols associated with them can be found carved into the walls of Ethiopia's rock-hewn churches. For them, the so-called Holy Grail was never a cup. It was a bloodline, and the Ark would be undeniable proof of that lineage. Traveling south from Axum, history quite literally emerges from stone. In Lalibela, the churches were not constructed by stacking stones, but by carving straight down into the earth. Entire cathedrals, complete with windows, pillars, corridors, and drainage systems, were shaped from a single mass of volcanic rock. Everything you see is part of the same stone. According to tradition, these structures were completed in just 24 years, a timeline many modern engineers find nearly impossible using conventional tools. Local legends say the people worked during the day, while angels continued the construction at night, using glowing instruments known as light tools. Even today, the precision of these churches raises questions. The Church of St. George, carved in the shape of a perfect cross, and the intricate drainage system that has survived centuries of rainfall still defy simple explanation. Beneath the surface, dark tunnels force those training for the priesthood to move forward without sight, guided only by touch and sacred chants, a symbolic passage through darkness before reaching the light. Modern scans have revealed hidden chambers beneath the complex, sealed away for centuries. Some believe ancient manuscripts are stored there. Others speak of artifacts, possibly even the tools used to accomplish what seems impossible. Every element of this story echoes the same theme. One must pass through shadow to find illumination. As the story deepens, the focus begins to shift. It's no longer only about ancient texts, impossible architecture, or sacred objects. It becomes about people, about families, about bloodlines. In the most familiar Western tradition, Jesus is portrayed as a solitary figure, no wife, no children, no descendants. His story appears to end definitively at the cross. But in the East, and especially in Ethiopia, this idea feels incomplete. There, family is not a side note. It is the foundation of everything. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty did not rule for a handful of generations, but for nearly 3,000 years. According to tradition, every emperor in this line claimed direct descent from King Solomon and, by extension, from the House of David. The final ruler, Haile Selassie, was regarded as the 225th monarch in this unbroken lineage and bore the title, the Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah. For many, this was not poetic symbolism, but a literal statement of ancestry. If this claim is taken seriously, the story becomes far more complex than the familiar version. The Gospels state that Mary herself belonged to the House of David. If both lineages trace back to the same origin, then these were not distant strangers separated by continents, but branches of the same extended family. This helps explain why, centuries later, the Rastafari movement would view Haile Selassie as a messianic figure tied to end-time prophecies. Selassie never declared himself divine, but he clearly understood the weight and meaning of his heritage. In time, science added an unexpected layer to the story. Genetic research has revealed that parts of the Ethiopian population carry ancient markers linked to the Levant, regions we now associate with Israel and Syria, dating back roughly 3,000 years. This suggests that actual migrations took place, not just legends passed down through oral tradition. The connection between Jerusalem and Ethiopia may therefore be not only symbolic, but human and biological as well. This also sheds light on why Ethiopian Christianity is so distinct. It preserves practices closely associated with ancient Judaism, dietary laws, circumcision on the 8th day, and observance of the Sabbath, all existing alongside Christian belief without contradiction. What seems to have survived here is a form of spirituality that predates Rome's later reforms and restructuring. From this perspective, it was not a conversion, but a continuation. These traditions were not adopted later. They were seen as part of the faith from the very beginning. And this is where one of the most controversial ideas in the entire story begins to surface. Some ancient texts and traditions suggest that Jesus may not have died on the cross at all. If that were true, then the lands connected to his own family would have been among the safest places for him to vanish from public history. In the most remote highlands of Ethiopia, stories are still told of a teacher who came from the north, a healer, a man of peace, known simply as the righteous teacher. The stories never name him as Jesus, but the parallels are difficult to dismiss. This leads to a troubling question. What if the Western search has always been aimed in the wrong direction? What if the greatest influence didn't remain in Galilee, but continued in Africa? Ethiopian monks expressed this idea in a simple phrase: "The West has the water, but we have the well." And according to their tradition, none of this unfolds suddenly. For centuries, these writings were hidden away in mountain monasteries, wrapped in goatskin, guarded by people who would rather die than surrender them. They survived insects, invasions, collapsing empires, and long ages of silence. And then, almost without warning, that silence began to break. In recent years, unofficial translations have surfaced. Fragments began spreading online so quickly that even scholars struggled to keep up. On digital platforms, algorithms now place these ideas beside entertainment and daily news, seen by millions not as a shocking revelation, but as something ordinary, almost incidental. The most radical interpretations go even further. They claim these texts describe a kind of fail-safe for humanity, something meant to activate only at a specific moment in history. They portray the present age as one of layered illusions, people speaking without mouths, seeing without eyes, caught inside a web that doesn't fully exist. For many readers, the parallels to the internet and artificial intelligence are impossible to ignore, and that is what makes this theory so deeply unsettling. These sages didn't only preserve religious belief, they passed down guidance for surviving in an age of illusion. When reality grows uncertain and trust in governments, media, and institutions begins to collapse, buried truths have a way of resurfacing. And to understand why this story feels so relevant now, all you have to do is look around. Confidence in authority is fading, institutions are questioned, and people are searching not just for leaders, but for meaning. This is why these books strike such a deep chord. They echo a feeling many have carried for a long time, that something was missing, that history was incomplete, that what we were given was a polished and simplified version of a much larger story. The final charge is blunt. These texts were removed not just to make belief easier, but to weaken humanity, to shift people from active participants in a larger struggle into passive spectators. And if parts of these manuscripts are not only spiritual but also technical, if they speak of earth-shaking forces or lost knowledge from before the flood, then what is returning is not simply another religion. It is an ancient way of understanding reality that never truly vanished. The real question, then, isn't whether all of this is literal truth or symbolic myth. The question is more unsettling. If the past was edited to control the present, what else has been concealed? And would you dare to read what was never meant to be read? This is where the story stops pointing backward and begins pointing directly at us. Ethiopian traditions place such strong emphasis on inner awareness, mastery of the mind, and refusing to surrender spiritual authority because, according to them, the greatest battlefield is not external. It exists within each person, not in armies or borders, but in attention, thought, and perception itself. These texts describe how confusion multiplies over centuries. Truth does not vanish. It becomes buried beneath layers of noise. Endless voices, constant information, conflicting messages, overwhelming content, and widespread misunderstanding. In that context, the warning about darkness suddenly makes sense. It doesn't arrive as open hostility, but as imitation, copying truth, disguising itself as a solution while draining the original meaning away. That is why these teachings stress understanding over belief, awareness over repetition, seeing over reciting. Silence, in this view, is not emptiness, but a tool. The pause between thoughts becomes sacred ground. From that stillness, they say, one can discern, recognize when a thought is born from fear, when it seeks control, and when it connects to something deeper. And this kind of spirituality, direct, inward, and uncompromising, is deeply uncomfortable for any system that depends on constant intermediaries. If every person could access what they truly need without permission, quotas, or rigid hierarchies, power would inevitably shift. And that helps explain why these traditions never aimed for rapid spread or mass conversion. Their goal wasn't to persuade the world, it was to endure. Not to dominate history, but to survive it. At this point, many people ask whether all of this should be taken literally. Were the angels actual beings or symbolic figures? Were the ships advanced technology or metaphors? Were the winds physical forces or states of mind? Interestingly, within Ethiopian tradition, these questions are not the focus. What matters is not how these things happened, but what they stir in us now. What do they awaken in the listener? Perhaps that is why these stories resurface during moments when humanity faces the same fundamental questions raised in ancient texts. Who controls knowledge? What is real? What is manipulation? And how much of our autonomy do we willingly surrender to systems that offer comfort in exchange for our attention? The difference is that control once appeared openly. Today, it is subtle, networked, layered, and almost invisible. From this perspective, there is no need to wait for some dramatic event to speak of the end times. The true decline would be internal, a slow disconnection from one's own awareness. And liberation, according to this view, would not come from the outside, but from memory. Remembering who you are. Remembering that you can observe without reacting, think without being swept away, and remain conscious even in noise. This is where many feel these stories strike something deeply personal, not like a doctrine, but like a mirror. They do not ask you to believe, they ask you to see. They do not say, follow me. They say, wake up. And that explains both their attraction and their rejection. These teachings do not promise safety or certainty. They promise responsibility. Perhaps that is why Ethiopia, with its quiet monasteries, rock-hewn churches, and unique biblical canon, appears in this story as the guardian of a different way of understanding faith. Not better or worse, just raw, less polished, less controlled. A faith that does not seek approval or applause, even though today, ironically, it travels through glowing screens. And so we return to the beginning, to the empty tomb. Perhaps the silence was never the ending, but the starting point. Perhaps what came afterward was not lost, but diverted, waiting quietly for the moment when someone would ask the right question again. Not what should I believe, but what should I see within myself? At this point, the story seems to move toward a conclusion, yet it never fully closes, as if a door has been intentionally left slightly open. Because from this perspective, everything said would be meaningless if it remained sealed off. Like any powerful story, its purpose was never to impress, but to provoke, to create inner movement, discomfort, a spark. Ethiopian monks often say that true knowledge is not imposed, announced, or shouted with trumpets. It is recognized, and that is why these teachings never spread as a conquering movement, never sought territory, and never tried to persuade the masses. These teachings remained hidden not out of fear, but out of care, out of a sense of kinship. Not everyone is ready for a truth that cannot simply be explained or handed over. In this understanding, resurrection is no longer just a one-time event in the distant past. It becomes an ongoing process. Not something that happened to a single person, but something that can happen to anyone willing to pass through the darkness of their own awareness. A closed, unconscious way of living comes to an end. Resurrection becomes a clearer way of being. That is why the constant attention to one's thoughts, to what we allow in through our senses and our words, takes on a deeper meaning. This is not about moral rules, it is about strategy. Because according to these texts, the real danger doesn't arrive through open violence, but through endless distraction. When the mind is overloaded, everything feels urgent. Peace disappears, and the inner connection fades without anyone noticing. That is why the adversary described here doesn't scream or destroy outright. It seduces, it imitates, it offers fast answers, it dresses itself as light. And paradoxically, it can drain anything of its meaning by speaking the language of faith, spirituality, or progress. It doesn't need to deny truth. Overwhelming it is enough. Seen this way, the warning against building temples of stone gains a deeper layer. It isn't a rejection of sacred places, but a reminder not to confuse the symbol with the essence. Anything external can be manipulated, commercialized, and exploited. What is internal is far harder to take. This is where the image of the retreating teacher begins to make sense, not as abandonment, but as a test. If everything depended on a physical presence, the teaching would remain fragile. By stepping back, responsibility shifts to each individual to become the guardian of their own awareness. Much like the lone guardian of the ark, dedicating his entire life to protecting something that cannot be displayed without danger. Perhaps that is why the story of the ark focuses less on what it is, and more on how a single person, unseen and unheard, devotes a lifetime to guarding it without applause or an audience. The message is not, look at what we possess, but look at the cost of protecting what truly matters. And when that idea is taken inward, it becomes even more demanding. In the end, everything returns to the same question that has echoed through history in many forms. Who governs your mind? What captures your attention? What do you consume, fear, and desire? Or can you still see clearly, without constant distraction? The Ethiopian texts, whether read literally or symbolically, stress that freedom is not something granted from outside. It is something created from within. And perhaps that is why this story is resurfacing now, in an era of non-stop connection, fragmented identities, and competing versions of truth. Not to prove that it happened, but to ask a far more personal question. What will you do with what you hear? Knowledge alone changes nothing if it isn't lived. And maybe it doesn't even matter whether every detail is historical or metaphorical. What matters is the quiet invitation beneath it all, to step off autopilot, to return to awareness, to recover a sense of inner peace. If anything remains to be resurrected, it is not hidden in a book, a relic, or a distant place. It lives in the way you choose to be present, right now. And so the circle nearly closes, not with a final answer, but with a choice. To keep searching outward, or to begin looking inward. Because according to this ancient tradition, the greatest secret was never hidden on some faraway mountain. It was always there, waiting for a moment of attention, for someone to pause long enough to notice it. And that is how the story ends. Not like closing a book, but like turning off a light so the eyes can adjust to the dark. Because, in the end, the truth was never outside at all. It wasn't hidden in a tomb, sealed behind a rolling stone, or locked away in an ancient manuscript guarded by monks on a mountain. The ending, or rather, the continuation, was always inward. In this tradition, the story of the resurrection is not meant to convince you to adopt a new doctrine or trade one belief system for another. Its purpose is far more unsettling. It asks you to take responsibility for your own mind, to recognize that the greatest deception is not that information is kept from you, but that you are constantly distracted, divided, and reacting. That you spend so much energy trying to understand the world that you never stop to ask, who is the one watching? That is why this story does not conclude with a dramatic revelation or a sign displayed for all to see. It ends with a quiet but decisive warning. If everything you've heard feels interesting, yet nothing in your life changes, then your way of living remains at the level of entertainment. And this knowledge, whether taken as literal or symbolic, was never meant to entertain. The empty tomb was not the conclusion. It was a test. Its absence forced the followers to choose. Continue relying on something external, or begin cultivating presence from within. That same choice appears again today, in a world overflowing with voices, opinions, and absolute truths that vanish with the next headline. This is why the tradition places such emphasis on silence, observation, and mastery of attention. Without these, any truth becomes just another story. With them, even myth becomes a way not to escape reality, but to move through it with clarity. In the end, it doesn't matter whether you believe in the Ark, the visionaries, the hidden manuscripts, or the churches said to be built by angels. What matters is the question that remains when everything grows quiet. Are you living fully awake, or simply reacting to what comes at you? Are you building temples in the outer world, or cultivating something within that cannot be taken from you? Ethiopian monks often say the West has the water, and they have the well. But perhaps the well is not in Ethiopia, or Rome, or Jerusalem. Perhaps it has always been in the one place few people think to look. And perhaps the true resurrection did not happen only once 2,000 years ago, but happens every time someone breaks free from inertia and remembers who they are. And there, the story ends, not with a final answer, but with a silent invitation.